Hello, friends, and welcome to Real History with Michael. And we're going to start this off with an equation. So, what do you get when you combine a power hungry, angry pope who likes to settle conflicts with battle more than peace, and two brothers who get in his way? Anybody? Let's take a look at the equation below.
A complete disaster. Remember this equation. You will need it later.
That's right, you get a complete disaster. It's also known, though, as the Pazzi Conspiracy. What happened? Well, guess what? You're about to find out. It's time to get into some real history with Michael. Ew. Let's get into it. Welcome back, friends and possums. So, the Pazzi Conspiracy took place on April 26th, 1478, in the Duomo in Florence during High Mass. Yep, that's right, High Mass. What the conspiracy entailed was an agreement under Pope Sixtus IV and a few other players we'll mention later on that would ultimately lead to a hit on the brothers Medici, Giuliano and Lorenzo, who were the de facto rulers of Florence at the time. And I have to say this for all of you Xbox Netflix historians. No, this did not go down like Medici's Masters of Florence, and it did not go down like Assassin's Creed. We're going to talk about the real stories. Let's get into it. So, the story begins with the Medici family. Prior to being renowned bankers and art patrons, his family got their start north of Florence in a city called Mugello. The family opened their first bank in 1397 under Giovanni de' Medici. Giovanni rose to prominence in Florence in the early 15th century as part of the wool and art guilds, in addition to being an international banker. He was put on as a leading citizen after he funded a pirate, Baldassare Casa's endeavor to become pope. Even though he was very rich, he maintained a humble demeanor and only entered politics when he was asked. Upon his death in 1329, his sons Lorenzo and Cosimo took over. So, Cosimo, for his part, was a patron of the arts and wielded more influence than that of his father in the city of Florence, which led to his banishment in 1433. Now, granted, of course, I wasn't there since I was born in 1990, but I would imagine it was something like this.
Run away and never return.
Now and never come back.
However, his money was everywhere in the city and it ran long, and without it, the city faltered and came to a standstill. A year later, he came back. He was the patron behind the Duomo, as well as Brunelleschi's orphanage in the city of Florence. He ruled with his brother Lorenzo the Elder until Lorenzo's death in 1440. But Lorenzo, while he didn't last very long, he started the cadet branch of the Medici family, which became the Grand Duke of Tuscany a century later and continued on far longer than the original Medici line. Cosimo died in 1464, and his son Piero the Gaudio took over. Having outlived Cosimo's favorite son Giovanni, he was an able administrator, but his reign lasted 5 years, was largely forgettable, and he succumbed to the gout. And his sons Lorenzo and Giuliano took over. So now we've been introduced to Giuliano and Lorenzo, who will become the masters of Florence. But we haven't gotten to how the Pazzi conspiracy actually started, which we're about to cover right now, so stay tuned. The Pazzi conspiracy actually dates back 5 years prior to 1473. The Pope, Sixtus IV, wanted to buy the city of Imola from the Duke of Milan, and everybody's favorite limb-yanking, wife-raping despot, Galleazo Sforza. And he undercut Lorenzo's attempts to buy the same city, and adding further insult to injury, he bought it at a much lower price. The Pope paid 40,000 ducats for it, and Lorenzo had offered 100,000 florins. He also gave his nephew to Sforza's then 10-year-old daughter to marry. And who funded this endeavor? The Pazzi family. Now, the Pazzi family were once a prominent family in the 14th century in Florence. And like the Albizzi before them, the family who ran Cosimo out of town, they lost their prominence when the Medici started to come up. In other words, they were haters. So not only did Lorenzo get mad, but he also got even by blocking Bishop Francesco Savietti from entering his bishopric in Pisa. Pisa was at the time a subsidiary of Florence, and that infuriated the Pope like nobody's business. Just for the record, this is the same Pope who died of apoplexy in 1484. So, the Pope was not one to take an insult lying down, so he decided it was time to get rid of the Medici brothers once and for all. After some convincing from Bishop Savietti, the Pope's nephew Girolamo Riario, and from banker Francesco de Pazzi. However, because he was the Pope, he had to choose his words very, very carefully so that he wasn't directly involved. Because after all, popes and priests, in theory, cannot kill. This hit that the Pope, wink wink, couldn't sanction also attracted the attention of our favorite cycloptic one-eyed Duke, Duke Federico de Montefeltro of Urbino. He committed 600 troops for this murder and what they hoped would be an uprising to follow afterwards. So after months of plotting and scheming and planning and dreaming, the attack was to be given at church during Mass when both brothers were sure to show up and be there at the same time. This was to be a tale spun as an uprising against despots and giving the people freedoms of what they wanted, not the political move that we all know it was to be. And the brothers weren't any the wiser when they made their way to the Cathedral de Santa Maria del Fiore that they were possibly having their last day on earth. It's showtime. April 26th, 1478. High Mass and the city is crammed in the cathedral. Except Giuliano de Medici. He actually suffered an injury prior, and so he arrived late. When he got there, he was met by Francesco de Pazzi, who hugged him to make sure that he wasn't wearing his armor underneath. Then the sign came, the consecration of the Eucharist. Giuliano barely stepped into the church when he was stabbed 19 times by Pazzi and by Bernardo Bandini, where he died on the floor in front of 10,000 people. Lorenzo was stabbed in the neck, but was saved by his friend Angelo Poliziano. There were also attempts to capture the Gonfaloniere, who was the standard bearer of Florence at the time, usually a contract player, and the Signoria, who was like the council, almost like Parliament, but they failed. The conspirators thought they would have the people on their side, and they miscalculated in a very big way. Giuliano did indeed pass away, but Lorenzo survived, so the plot failed. But you know who wasn't having it? The people of Florence. Now, I wasn't there, obviously. I'm only 29. But I hear the people had this to say.
I've had it officially!
I'm gonna give you 5 seconds to defend yourself or take this ass whooping.
They went buck wild. Remember the equation.
Remember this equation.
Shit is getting real!
Lorenzo tried to quell the violence, even going so far as to save Cardinal nephew Raffaele Riario Sansoni, who was Pope Sixtus's nephew, but the people meant business. Most conspirators, like Pazzi and Salvietti, were caught, beaten, had ropes tied around their necks, and were hurled from windows. However, Girolamo Riario managed to escape.
Kudos to you, bitch.
But nobody, and I do mean nobody, had it as bad as Jacopo de Pazzi, the family head. He escaped, only to be found, dragged through the streets, booty butt naked, mind you, tortured. He got the window hanging treatment. He was buried. He was exhumed. He was strung up at his door using his head as a door knocker. He was cut back down. He was tossed into the river Arno. He was fished out. He was hung from a tree. He was whipped and then tossed back into the river Arno. In 3 years, 80 people who were connected to the conspiracy were killed, but Girolamo Riario made it 10 years before he himself was assassinated. When the Pope found out, he was furious, and he actually planned to go to war with Florence and impose their interdict, meaning that people in Florence could not get communion, they couldn't go to have mass, they could have funerals, weddings, anything that required the church, they could not do it. And so Lorenzo, he gave himself to his enemies by going to Naples, but before he did that, he gave a rousing speech. He cried, they cried, you cried, I cried, we all screamed for ice cream. It was amazing. And it worked. When he went to Naples, he charmed the king and managed to broker a peace between him and the Pope, even though the Pope was dragged into it kicking and screaming. That is the Pazzi Conspiracy, ladies and gentlemen.